Hello, I'm Eric Sorensen, and this is the West Block, Politics, Perspectives and Players. Bold, brash Boris Johnson is Britain's new Prime Minister. He believes Brexit will happen with a new deal that the UK and the EU will sign. So what does this mean for the UK and beyond? Joining us now from London is the former Deputy Chief Executive of BBC News, Richard Eyre. Richard, thanks for joining us. Your new Prime Minister certainly exudes confidence. Does a new deal seem possible, as he says, by October 31st, or is he setting everyone up for a blame Europe hard exit?
No, Eric, nobody has ever doubted Boris Johnson's self-confidence. He's full of it, and his main pitch to the nation in the few days since he became Prime Minister has been that we should share that confidence in ourselves as a nation. If the slogan hadn't been taken by somebody else already, I guess it would be "Make Britain Great Again." The problem is that for those who don't believe in Boris Johnson, they say that faith isn't enough, that you have to have policies. And at the moment, his only policy that we know of is that Britain will leave the EU by the 31st of October, whether or not it reaches a deal with the EU. How we should reach a deal, what that deal should say, is completely unknown to us, and the fear is that it might be unknown to him too.
In simple terms, I mean, Brexit speaks to creating a border between the EU and the UK, and yet the only land border that exists is between Ireland and Northern Ireland, of all places. Speak to why that is such a hard hurdle to clear.
The problem is the EU have insisted that any withdrawal agreement between the UK and the EU must include what's called the backstop. In other words, an insurance policy which says that if after many months, maybe even years, of trying to reach a trade deal between the EU and the UK, if those talks fail to achieve a deal, which means there doesn't need to be a border, then the UK will have to remain within the EU customs union to enable the free movement of goods across the border. At the moment, there's a complete standoff. Boris Johnson has said very clearly in the last 3 days there will be no agreement while the backstop continues to be part of it. And the EU have responded by saying the backstop absolutely has to be part of a withdrawal agreement. It's stalemate. Who knows what will happen?
Now, Canada's not a part of that at all, but Canada-UK trade could be affected by all of this. There was a trade deal pretty much finalized, but that now seems to be on hold. Is Brexit already having an effect on Canada-UK trade?
Not yet. But actually, the effect over the last 2 years has been positive for both sides, because 2 years ago, the EU, including, of course, the UK, reached a deal with Canada for tariff-free or very low tariff trade between our two countries. The problem is that once we leave the European Union, we will not be part of that agreement which was reached between the EU and Canada. So the UK proposed that there should be a continuation of the agreement bilaterally between the UK and Canada. Sounds sensible. The two countries should continue to charge very low tariffs or no tariffs on one another's goods. That sounded great. But earlier this year, for fear that prices of all imported goods were going to rise when Britain leaves the EU, the British government announced that it would charge no tariffs on most goods arriving into this country from any country in the world. So the Canadians said, hang on, why should we grant special access to Canada's markets for the UK if the UK is throwing open its doors and welcoming all countries of the world to import into the UK without paying tariffs? So the potential deal between Britain and Canada is now on ice. It may be dead. If it isn't resurrected, then by the 31st of October, if Boris Johnson keeps his word and Britain leaves the EU, then Canada will be obliged under World Trade Organization rules to start charging significant tariffs on a whole range of UK goods, including food and drink. And that will inevitably push up prices for Canadian consumers, and more to the point for us, it will hit British exports.
I want to ask you about the relationship between, say, our Prime Minister and your new Prime Minister. But first, let me start with Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and the relationship between the UK and the US and what kind of an alliance of interests that could emerge from that.
Now, it's true, of course, that the two men have much in common. They both have this shock of blonde hair, much beloved of cartoonists. They both like nothing more than addressing a huge audience and telling the audience whatever it is they want to hear. Both of them have had very colourful private lives, and they both say things in public that they later regret and then deny having said them. And perhaps most fundamentally, they both share a passing familiarity with the truth. But there are very, very serious differences between the two. Boris Johnson is actually a pretty bright guy. Intellectually, he rings around Donald Trump. Johnson speaks fluent French. He speaks fluent Italian. He speaks fluent, would you believe, Latin, surprisingly often using it. Donald Trump's command of even English raises some doubts. They don't share a worldview. It's very unlikely that Boris Johnson is going to support America's approach to Iran, further trying to isolate Iran. Johnson shares the European view that you engage Iran with incentives and with talk to try to secure their nuclear plans. Boris Johnson is at heart a liberal.
Richard, we only have a few seconds, and I just want to get you, just in those few seconds, to say whether you think that Prime Minister Trudeau could be out of step with Johnson and Trump because he is so unlike them.
No, I think actually Boris Johnson and Trudeau have much more in common than you might think. They're both clever, they're both bright, they're both basically liberal, the very opposite of Donald Trump. I think Canadians have almost nothing to fear from an alliance between Trump and Johnson.
All right.
Nothing to fear at all.
Richard Eyre, thank you very much for talking to us from London.
You're welcome.